Welcome everyone, my name's Sujata Burman, I'm from London Design Festival. I'm here with Michael Anastassiades in this Herman Miller talk to talk through these new prototype chairs that we've got and the relationship between Herman Miller and Michael. I wanted to start by saying this is the kind of Herman Miller ancillary collection, and they're celebrating a couple of different launches this year during London Design Festival. I wanted to start, I don't know if all of you know Michael's work, so we're going to start by talking about his studio and how that started in 2007. And I was thinking to myself earlier, because I'm a journalist.
The brand started in 2007.
Oh, the brand started in 2007, there we go.
The studio started in 1994.
1994, yeah. So. I was looking at a couple of pieces that I'd written about you, and I was thinking about the words that I'd used to describe your work. And words that shot out were like poetic and timeless. And I think we want to go through these kind of feelings and what kind of work you do. And I think one of the most interesting things is that you studied civil engineering and then went to the RCA. Can you tell me about that transition?
I always wanted to do something creative right from the beginning, ever since I was in school and then about to go to university. But for some reason, you know, it was too scary of a risk to take for my family. My parents at the time did not encourage that. You know, the idea of doing anything creative was definitely not going to lead to any success. So the option of being an architect for me didn't, you know, really attract me at that time. Although, you know, if I was really aware what it involved, I came from a very small place. So things were very difficult in terms of exposure. So later on, halfway in the sort of engineering studies, which would get me a job or a guaranteed job, I kind of figured out that this is definitely not what I wanted to do, but decided to kind of continue and finish off. But I discovered the Royal College, and design, you know, was a very new field for me. And as I said, growing up, I didn't have that exposure to think and what was available to study in the creative field. I would say, like, other options other than just simply be an artist. Yeah. For me, it was either the one or do something practical. And so, then that was when things kind of changed completely.
Do you think then that you've managed to weave in the two together since, you know, your experience from the engineering side as well?
I think subconsciously, yes. I always felt that I ran away from engineering as far as I could possibly get to. You know, it was just like I went completely the other extreme. After I finished my studies, I felt so frustrated of being an engineer. Went to the Royal College in an engineering-based sort of master's, and then figured out also, as soon as I started the course, that this is not what I want to do yet again, yet another time. So I just wanted to be free. And I felt that even my studies at the Royal College were quite kind of constrained. But at the same time, I think subconsciously, deep down, the practical way of thinking and your education in addressing issues, and I think helped in the way that I design now and the way that I see things now. I think everything you do in life at the end of the day has to have some effect on what you produce.
A lot of what I've read, what you've said before, is that it's about the way you make people feel. And when you started out in 1994, is that kind of what you went with to begin with?
I felt that after I started my studio in 1994, that was basically a year after I graduated, I figured out that I was unemployable. I mean, I tried to get a job as a designer. I couldn't get a job as a designer. I couldn't get a job as an engineer either, because I didn't want to be an engineer. So at the end of the day, I needed to figure out what design means to me. And so I used that big chunk of time to really search for that answer. And I call them the research years. So I was producing objects. I was a designer. They were certainly design objects, but they were critical in the sense that they question the role of design in our daily lives, and also more on focusing on electronic products and how they were affecting our lives. So I think I operated pretty much like an artist looking back at it, because the things that I was producing had a great appeal, but at the same time only on an institutional level as kind of exhibition pieces, as statements. So it was much later down the line when I figured out that I was really missing something in what I was doing, and I really believed in industrial production, and that's when I decided to explore that, but many years down the line.
Yeah, so how did that transition happen from the research years and working like an artist to working with companies like Floss, which you're very well known to have your lighting for?
The big change for me was like when I realized that at that point, after having spent all these years in design and really understanding the whole struggle of every designer, of how do you actually break that kind of curse. You know, you're young, you have all these ideas you want to share, but nobody wants to work with somebody that is not established or famous already. Because what happens is usually companies start knocking at your door only when they want a share of a cake you're already eating. So they say, can I have some of that? And then they want to work with you. So how was I going to break that? And the big change happened when I decided in 2007 to start my own brand of lighting, and under my own name, and without any experience, without any help from anybody. I said, I will figure it out. I want to go into production. I'll design my pieces, produce them, sell them. And then it was only like, I would say, 4 years down the line when I did my first presentation of my brand as a brand in Euroduce, which was the biggest kind of fair worldwide. And it still is to this day that, the smallest stand I could possibly afford, and say, this is me, this is what I produce. And that's when Floss saw me and said, hey, where have you been hiding all these years? I said, well, I'm here. But,
I've been in the studio researching.
It's quite ironic. I mean, at the end of the day, it is true, 100% true, because you try knocking at the door yourself, and the door is always shut. It's shut. There's no way it can open. And then from then on, when we embarked on this journey with Floss, then this is when, my first biggest sort of furniture, and this is a great, credit that I have to give to Herman Miller at the end of the day, because by that date I was known as Mr. Lighting. This is the lighting designer. He's not a designer. He designs light fixtures. He designs lamps, and his specialty is in lighting. And then suddenly a company like Herman Miller to come and say, hey, we like what you do, but could you apply that in furniture?
So how did the door open? How did they approach you and ask?
It was a contact by them, and it was right at the beginning of Ben Watson being appointed as a creative director of Herman Miller, and basically he sent me an email and say, hey, I'm in town, I'd love to meet you, I'm curious, I like what you do, and let's have a conversation. And it's interesting because it wasn't so much about approaching somebody to ask them, hey, we want to work with you. It's like, let's meet, let's see how we both feel. And the whole flirting game actually took quite a while. I mean,
The chase.
Yeah, back and forth. And then they said, oh, we'd like to invite you over to, Michigan, and then you see where we are. And I say, oh, great, fantastic. So what are we doing? I said, let's talk, let's explore. And it took a little while. I mean, I did find a time when I visited Michigan, and then the conversation started, and then at that moment came the first sort of brief,
and
which is
the
spots tool.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because it was overwhelming for me because I love the idea of that my first furniture or industrial, let's say, furniture piece was a stool, because it's the smallest thing you can actually, do and design. But at the same time, is really beautiful, and I love the idea that it's so has so many functions. I use tools everywhere in my house, and still to this date. And I had kind of objects as tools and as tables, and the sense of mobility. You can grab it, you can take it to another place, you can use it. You know, it has so many functions, and sometimes when you have very few chairs around the table, it's just the easiest thing is to just grab a stool and go and sit someplace. Whereas a chair is, I think, has more a dedicated kind of position in the house.
And so what inspired the kind of shape? It has that kind of delicacy and poetry I feel like you're known for, but talk us through how you kind of thought about it.
You know, it's interesting because I think it's the simplest thing I could come up with. You know, I think definitely exploring that sense of balance, because the stool is not balanced. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, you have two poles, none of them is central. You're looking for trouble, you know, right from the beginning. So I like that challenge. And I think what's interesting is also technically, Herman Miller were interested in that challenge. Is how do we actually achieve that? You know, why don't you put the post in the middle? Then you're going to make everyone's life so much easier.
Just wouldn't look as good though.
I don't want the post in the middle, so I want two posts, and you know, none of them should be in the middle. And then obviously this idea, this sense of elements that seem like they're just simply touching each other. And I think this was what I wanted to achieve, and I think this is what we managed to achieve. Even the footrest, if you look at it, there's no welding anywhere, no visible welding anywhere. It's just the tube touching the other vertical tube, and also how it translates into all the three different heights that we produced. And again, after that, obviously, materiality, you know, that is really absolutely fundamental in this project. You know, that sense of using wood, and also if it was metal, then, you know, it's interesting because we decided to present the stool in Salone del Mobile, and it was before, you know, we finalized all the details. And so they asked me and say, well, you know, what are the finishes? I said, I want the metal to be brass. And they said, well, we never worked in brass. I said, it doesn't matter, it's a presentation, then we figure it out later. And then it's true, you know, we agreed that this was only going to be a presentation, and that later on we were going to revise because it's absolutely non-achievable, and also for commercial reasons, maybe this is really not something that is common in the furniture industry, you know, producing, let's say, furniture in brass, because it had all these kind of problems. So we managed that, and then post-exhibition we kind of looked at the object. We said, okay, you know, let's make it now in all the other metal finishes but brass, because, you know, it's not possible to do it. And everybody wanted brass, of course. And,
once you show something at Salone, it's gone through so many people's eyes.
Of course.
And
that's important, I think, is also to change people's perception, because also within the company itself, it's interesting, because, you know, you're used to things in a certain way. And I want to really put an emphasis on this, because it was the beginning of my partnership also with Floss, right at the start, when you know, my first project was the string lights, but in parallel, I proposed the IC lamps, which became, let's say, the biggest success story for Floss for all these years. And then Piero Gandini, the owner and CEO at the time, turned around and said to me, well, you know, surely we're not producing this in brass. I said, absolutely we are producing this in brass. And he says to me, Michael, I'm not too sure it's going to work. Germany hates brass. And I said, well, that's a big statement. I said, maybe you hate brass, I said to him. But Germany surely, you know, the whole of Germany hating brass. No. Germany is chrome, 100%. And Germany is a big market for Floss. You know, I was in Germany, I lived in Germany. I said, Piero, you just simply don't believe in brass. I said, it will be brass, and there will be other options. Number one, sales, brass. Everything else never sold, you know, not even like 1/5 of the quantity that we sold in brass. I mean, of course, later on, you know, other finishes were added, but it was pretty much the same thing, you know, in the stool, in the spot stool. And then eventually the challenge was, how do we actually present it in brass to to have the strength and to retain all those qualities that we presented in that exhibition,
Yeah.
you know, which for me was really an amazing presentation.
Well, it was very beautiful, and I think it was quite different from what Herman Miller's done before. It was called The Double Dream of Spring, and you know, were Herman Miller quite accepting of this more artistic side of what you do? It seemed like that's what they were kind of inviting.
Well, it was flattering because obviously they say, hey, you know, we want to present you in our next Salone, so you will be the focus and your pieces will be the focus. And here's our showroom and we want you to design the show. So I wanted, you know, I wanted this to be a very strong kind of statement. So decided to kind of take the space and treat it like a canvas, like a blank canvas, and really, obviously, later on we had to face all the challenges for costs and, you know, how do we actually present this and how do we make it cost effective, because everything had to fit a budget. So this sense of making this volume, this double volume of space in Milan, which was remarkable, and separating it from the rest of the store and creating it more as an exhibition space was really the biggest challenge. And then treating everything as a grid, you know, of these, you know, tiles, this kind of 60 by 60 tiles where we kind of position each stool and then present them more like kind of chess pieces. I don't think we have any pictures, unfortunately, of the double dream of spring, but it was a very beautiful presentation that everybody remembers, because, you know, Milan is quite a
moment for experimentation, I would say, and that was
I
definitely.
think everybody, you know, is fighting for time. You know, there's so many things that you're there to see, and is who steals the show. But it's not so much about stealing the show. It's about really somebody that's going to make an effort to go and see what you're presenting. You really have to put the time that it needs to make it special, I think, for them.
So your collaboration has evolved now with Herman Miller over the years, and today we have the Comma chairs. How did this come about? Tell me a bit about.
Well, this is, I would say, is a fourth project with Herman Miller, because following the spot stool, we have the double frame table. I think you see a glimpse of it on the middle circle on the right. That's the double frame table. And then after that, we had the bedroom, the pillar bed suite, because there were a few pieces in the collection. And then finally, the last brief was to come up with a chair in wood. And obviously, you know, having to have that sense of, let's say, high perceived, let's say, value, and also that element of domesticity, but at the same time being somewhere between a contract piece, also a domestic piece. Because right from the beginning, it was the intention from Herman Miller to try to bridge that gap. You know, what is home, what is office? And it's interesting because it's so much more relevant today than it was back then when we started. Because, you know, back then we were talking about offices being more like kind of home environments, just to make people feel more relaxed and, you know, just grab a wooden chair, sit on it and have a conversation, or have lunch all together in that kind of communal areas. So, you know, even early on, and now, of course, everything is, if everybody's working from home, or at least many people have.
And talk me through the kind of the shape, the kind of geometry of the circle with the frame.
It needed to be comfortable.
Okay.
For sure. And you needed to feel like you could sit in the chair for long periods of time. It needed to be welcoming at the same time. You know, the scale was also important. The sense that it couldn't be too big. You know, it's interesting because, you know, through my experience with working with Herman Miller, which is an American sort of brand, is that things in America are always kind of bigger, and stronger. And it's interesting because it's even like, let's say, standards that you design and the test that everything has to go through is absurd. I will never forget when I was designing the spot stool, when we were really fighting with, not arguing or fighting, but fighting with ourselves in a sense of, how do you make this stool be strong, because if it snaps, if it breaks. And they said, well, somebody has to be able to use the stool as a step ladder. And if they step right on the edge rather than on the middle of the stool, of the seat, then it shouldn't tip over and it shouldn't break. And you say, well, it's a stool, it's not a step ladder. And they say, yes, but otherwise
you
we're
did
going
say
to
it
be...
was multifunctional as well.
We're going to be sued. At the end of the day, we're going to be sued. And so, of course, everything has to be over-engineered and over-designed. But I think going back to what we've learned from the spot stool and looking at the Coma chair, because it's been a journey, is to make something in full wood that has that kind of simplicity in the language and that kind of domestic feel, one material all around. And of course, everything else. I think the icon started from the armchair, with the back wrapping around, becoming the armrests, and also the angle, how it kind of changes. So it's kind of wraps around your back.
And you mentioned journey in the design. How long has this been kind of in the works, and how does it work with Herman Miller in terms of tweaking the design and kind of getting prototypes? Tell me a bit about how that works.
Well, it's been tricky over the pandemic and having to do that, because it's you've got to figure out all the logistics before. I could easily say, oh, hey, we have the prototypes ready, would you come over? And we all meet at the factory, and then you have 2 intense days looking at things, solving problems. So now everything had to be kind of timed. But it worked. It worked really beautifully, because what they would do is they would make, let's say 3 pieces, 3 samples, and then they would ship 1 to New York to the people that were meeting in New York, 1 to us, and they would keep 1, and then we would be looking at the same object. And so it was interesting. It was possible, but with product design and furniture, I always say like an average is always around 2 years. Sometimes if it stretches, then it becomes, let's say, 3. But I think if you're under 2 years, you're pushing everyone's luck.
You'll be falling over on the stool.
Well, it's not so much that. I mean, there's so many things that you have to get right, and especially when designing something for such a big company. I think the complexities of delivering something in the world of that it has to tick so many boxes. And right at the point when you always think that, okay, I found a solution for this, and then there's something else. And every phone call there would be like, hey, we have great news, it passed this, but it didn't pass that, and what can we do about it?
I think something quite nice about this one as well is the addition of colour. How did you decide to start doing the staining for the colours, and
Well, I wanted to find,
colours?
let's say, a more affordable option for the chair that would achieve that sense of, let's say, mono materiality. I think that what's interesting in the color version is that the whole thing is just like one color, and I wanted to kind of go for something more bold rather than the standard, let's say, gray, black, white. And of course, the gray, black, and white will be there. And I think it's important because I think in the world of architecture, I think color is a little bit of a risk. But, I think it's interesting to present colors because, and especially those particular colors, I think they look a little bit off in the picture. The reality is not quite like that. I think the red is more like a kind of a burgundy, and I think the blue is more like a kind of a petrol blue. So it's slightly sort of more muted, but they're really, really amazing colors. Because I always, even myself, you know, when I introduce colors, I'm not so kind of easy with color either. Yeah. So it has to make sense why the color. I think what's beautiful to kind of mention, although this is one early prototype of the chair, but it's the combination of leather with the wood. So there's a sense of this kind of floating kind of cushion on the wooden frame. It's quite an interesting, let's say, version, and as you can guess probably that this applies to every chair, the armchair and the stool as well. So
yeah, and we've heard about your journey coming from 1994 to now. I would ask, what kind of advice would you give for people designing today or aspiring designers, recent graduates?
I think the time is different now, and of course, when I graduated, it was probably right at the beginning of the internet, and to have a computer was even like a big thing. You felt like so high tech somehow back then. The availability of all these kind of programs. I mean, it was very interesting time. So that sense of exposure was very limited. You relied very much on
the standard Euroluce.
Yeah, a standard Euroluce press, like printed press and magazines, and how do you actually approach the journalists? Now everybody can show their work, and I think it's fantastic that they have that opportunity. And of course, with all the social media, or the craze of social media, and there's good things about them, but there's also a lot of bad things about them. I think more bad than good, if you ask me, but the reality is the reality, and I think we all have to embrace it some way or another. But I think that the younger generation have that kind of access to that exposure more easily. Whether their life is easier, I wouldn't say so. But the thing that worries me is that everybody is after some quick results. And I think this is the phenomenon of the times that we live in. It's kind of this tech kind of industry, they're sort of, they want to start up something and then they sell it for millions and then take the money and run. I mean, I'm wondering whether this really should apply to design. And unfortunately, this phenomenon, let's say, translates to everything, because the younger generation, this is what they see. What they're interested is to be successful, famous, rich, everything, And what they really have to acknowledge is what takes you towards what you would like to kind of achieve, and really not to put those as the absolute priorities.
Yeah, well,
but more like finding it or figuring it out. I think my advice would be that you really have to believe in what you do, and that's the first question that you need to ask yourself. If you're going to think that this is just a trick to take you someplace, then I think you should just forget about it, because it's not going to work. And I think maybe it would work for some people, but it's such a tiny, tiny percentage. I think people are after substance, and if you're going to communicate that, you need to be consistent. You need to also be persistent in terms of arriving or showing, let's say, your view to the world of design. I think that's important. In individuality, you need to add something, you need to offer something. By simply kind of stealing things from all over the place, putting them in a blender and then, throwing them on the table, I don't think this is really design. And this is what, I would advise people to avoid.
Yeah. Were there any questions for Michael? Anyone had any questions? I always take that as a good thing that we've covered everything.
No, I think it's good. Let's have questions. I like questions.
Do we?
And
Yes,
it's
we
nice.
do. There we go.
How is your creative process? If you start with just putting all your emotions on the paper, or you are more rational guy and then you start to think about manufacturing and all this?
I daydream. That's not my number one thing. You know, I sit, you know, and especially pre-pandemic, you know, I was finding myself in constantly traveling and being in these horrible places, very uninspiring places that everybody's familiar, you know, airports, taxis, this, that, buses, trains, and at the end of the day, I think you need to kind of take yourself away from that environment. So that sense of that ability, I think, or talent to be able to kind of daydream and kind of detach yourself from this environment is number one rule for me. And then, of course, my sketchbook is the most precious thing that I carry with me everywhere I go. So I sketch a lot, you know. Then, you know, after I daydream, then I decide to kind of take my sketchbook out and then start sketching and randomly and keep those ideas in the sketchbook. And then some of them mature, and then, you know, I would come back after a trip, or I would look at things after a month or two or even a year, and then think, you know, I want to make this, I want to try and explore this. And then usually the creative process involves like this challenge of translating something from a sketch or a line, because some things are not even like proper ideas in the sketchbook, and making them into real products. And I try to avoid any computers possible. I try to kind of mock things up, whether it's in scale or whether it's in full scale. I would make models, and then after that, I think then we can feed the information in the computers and try to explore things differently. But it's only, the computers are there only to support on the technical kind of side of things, but not on the creative side of things. I think that experience of that encounter that you have with the physical object, because at the end of the day, we design objects. So I never really enjoyed, let's say, rendering programs that give you that sense of things, and the reality is that, you know, 99% of the world works in that way. But, you know, I think we need to change that. I think this is interesting because it's probably the thing that I missed most during the pandemic, is that absence of physicality, or not only kind of physical contact with people, but also with real objects. On one hand, you had it because you were able to spend so much time at home, and therefore, you know, you had all these objects around you, and you were appreciating, you know, them for the first time in your life. But at the end of the day, in the creative process, you know, everybody had to send images of things, and you know, you couldn't feel the weight of something, you couldn't smell it, you couldn't. And I think all those elements that are missing from this way of communication, I think are absolutely fundamental, that we need to make sure that they exist in everybody's practice.
Yeah, I remember when I came to your studio and you were doing your Maison exhibition, and you had the whole exhibition in a maquette form, and I thought that was beautiful. You don't usually see that, like, building of the
It's important because I think there's a lot to learn, even from a scale model of a space. You know, it's just like you see it. Maybe it's kind of like a dollhouse kind of size or whatever. But even that experience, that imagination of imagining yourself in that space, or, you know, putting
Mini Michael.
A small scale figure in there, and then trying to imagine that figure is you in that space. How do you feel about it? Because you need to decide, what do I make the model in? You know, what material, paper or wood or something else, or do I dress it, do I paint it? You know, all these decisions, and they have nothing to do with reality at the end of the day and what you're going to use in the eventual, but they're questions that are there and I think are absolutely fundamental, that you kind of, they make you think, and I think they feed the creative process.
Yeah. Were there any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Do you ever have any creative blocks, and what do you do to break yourself out of them?
When I have blocks, I swim. I go swimming. I mean, you need to kind of escape from these moments, and sometimes you just can't force it. You know, it happens to everybody. You know, you're done. You're kind of maxed out. But you know, I think accepting it is the number one kind of step, and then trying to find something that makes you change that frame of mind, and then give it space. I think that's the best thing. I think you can't force it, and a lot of the times I go back to companies when we have a deadline and I say, hey, I need a little more time. And it's not that I need a little more time because I jammed too many things in, or I miscalculated the time that was needed for the project, and you know, or whatever, or give them a cheap excuse. I tell them the reality is that the project needs some space to breathe. And I think taking that space and, you know, stepping back and then coming back to it the second time, I think you can see a lot of things.
Yeah. Any more questions? I think we're good. I think we've got some refreshment. Oh, one more. We'll get one.
Sure.
Are you still looking for companies that you have an idea and you go there to offer your idea to them, or it's just now that companies come to you and ask you for a project together?
I think I have to share let's say, how painful the process of, you know, picking yourself up and going and knocking at the door. And I've done it so much for so many years that it's really draining. And every time you come out of a meeting and then sometimes they say, oh, you know, that's great, but it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. I think that it's the reality. I mean, look at it in human relationships. You know, it's the standard thing. If you go after somebody, they don't want you. If you ignore them, they want you. You know, if you run away, they want you even more. You know, it's crazy, but that's the reality. This is part of human nature. It's a game. It's a game every time. And even at this point where I am, I have decided, you know what, you need to be content with the things that you have. I mean, my main, I think the place that I'm in now is that I'm not interested to put my signature on every single product in the world, you know. I feel happy even with the smallest, let's say, brief or challenge or whatever, as long as it makes sense to me. So, you know, I don't care if, let's say, X company or Y company, which are on outside, let's say, my current client list are not really knocking at my door, you know. And I think a lot of designers suffer from that syndrome. You know, they have this, but they want also that because so-and-so has this and that and the other thing and whatever. And just like, it's irrelevant at the end of the day. What's important is the quality of the work, whether you produce it for a big name or a smaller name or whatever. I mean, you can turn around and say, yeah, but you know, you're lucky to have Floss and you're lucky to have Herman Miller and you're lucky to have all these kind of great companies, but I didn't go for them, you know. I just, and I didn't snob the other ones. It just happened. And I think it's important to take on a challenge for whoever it could be, whether it's one or the other, because being a big name or a big brand, it doesn't mean more success, more money, more this, more that. It's what you put in it, I think, that's the most important thing. And it's amazing because you hear comments, you know, being in the industry is like, oh, the most successful chair is, in terms of numbers, is this chair, by the most generic company you can imagine, by the most, you know, it's irrelevant then after that. And they probably make a lot more money than, let's say, a product by a big brand or whatever. So it's, I think the idea of you know, this sense of establishment, you know, what it means to everybody, I think shouldn't actually be there when you accept the brief.
On that note, sorry, was there one more question?
Is any research, and if so, how is it conducted, to see if the product is popular in the market before it gets there in creation?
You know, you get a sense. You can't, you know, you can't search it. I mean, at the end of the day, we do a lot of, you know, product development all the time. And a lot of the times I have to take the risk because I have my own brand of lighting. And when I started my brand, you know, I never started it from a point of, you know, from a place of like having like a focus on, let's say, making it commercial. For me, was not really the idea of making a successful product. So my idea of success was really to bring out the qualities that I believed in. And a lot of the products that I have in my own collection, it's important to mention that because for me, my brand represents the ultimate freedom. I don't have to satisfy anybody's brief. I don't have to listen to anybody. I have the idea, I design it, I produce it. And it doesn't have to make sense. And some of the products that I developed in my collection, if you were to do that research that you're telling me about, like 99.9% of the people would put a big cross on it and say, it's not going to work. And now that particular product that I am talking about is the #1 income for the brand. So it's a phenomenon, but you know, why does it work? Because I believe in it. And I had to demonstrate why I believe in it. If I simply had to believe in it without demonstrating that value and communicating that value to the people and then say, hey, you're going to spend a lot of money on a light fixture, but it's not just a simple light fixture. And that's the answer that, you know, these are the questions that you need to kind of answer to the people and give that value, communicate that value to them. And that's the focus. So market research is irrelevant because market research is saying, hey, you know, so-and-so is making money. I want a slice of that cake. But, you know, it just doesn't work like that. I think the most important is to bake the cake, bake a new cake, which is better, you know, new, different, that doesn't exist.
You're making us hungry. I think there's some lunch outside. If there's any more questions, I'm sure we can
Sure.
be outside
Please
and
feel free
approach
to,
Michael. Thank you very much,
me.
everyone.
Thank you.